Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of HJRES 45, which would block the Biden administration's debt transfer scheme and prevent any further extension of the student loan repayment pause. For Democrats, there's a specter looming over this debate, an incontrovertible truth that disproves all their supposed principles and contradicts all their virtue signaling. Student loan cancellation is regressive. Let me repeat that for the Progressive Caucus. Student loan cancellation is regressive. 2/3 of this debt transfer plan would go to the top half of earners. It takes from those in the lower half and gives to the upper half. It redistributes wealth, but from the bottom of our socioeconomic ladder to the top. For example, the repayment pause has provided $65,000 in de facto loan cancellation for the average lawyer. This is a professional class bailout. More specifically, it is a professional class graduate degree holder bailout. Of the loans that will be dispersed in 2024, 70% will be borrowed for graduate school. Nearly 40% of those people will go on to make over $100,000 annually in their careers. Those are the data absent partisan spin provided directly from the Department of Education. The spin comes from the left when they use words like forgiveness. There's no such thing as forgiveness. The Biden administration is simply transferring the debt from borrowers who willingly took out student loans to hardworking taxpayers who did not. The 87% of Americans who hold no federal student debt are paying for the 13% who do. On top of that, the bailout is inflationary, which is always and everywhere a regressive working class tax. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, inflation could rise by as much as 27 basis points if mass student debt cancellation is implemented. Enacting mass student loan cancellation could also lead to an additional 2 rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. Billionaires don't feel the effect of inflation. They don't notice when eggs cost $5.99 a dozen. They don't need to take out a mortgage to pay for their house, but working Americans do. Inflation already has a vice grip on blue-collar America. In fact, The Hill reported yesterday that, quote, a record share of Americans in a new survey from the Federal Reserve Board say they are worse off financially than they were a year earlier, end quote. That's troubling, and alone should be enough evidence to pass HJRES 45 and nullify the Biden administration's deficit-increasing inflationary plan. But in typical limousine liberal fashion, Democrats want future taxpayers and hardworking Americans to foot the bill. Americans shouldn't buy it. America also shouldn't buy accusations from the left that HJRES 45 will charge borrowers back pay or interest payments. It couldn't be further from the truth. Nowhere in this resolution does it mandate back pay. It's prospective, not retrospective. If anything, it will be Secretary Cardona's decision to enact back pay. We know who will pay for the loans if the administration's plan is allowed to go forward. Those who will pay are those without degrees and those who paid off their debt. Those who can't afford to put gas in their car or food on the table. The rest is just political noise. I urge Congress to cut through that noise and stop this administration from enacting the biggest transfer of wealth from blue-collar workers to white-collar professionals in our nation's history. I urge my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 45, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as they may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.J. Res. 45. 43 million Americans are eligible for President Biden's student loan relief. That's an average of almost 100,000 people in each of our districts. Nearly 26 million borrowers in congressional districts all over the country have already applied for relief, including 16 million who have already been approved prior to litigation stopping the process. H.J. Res. 45 seeks to deny these borrowers the relief they were promised. And to be clear, the people who impacted this are not the wealthy and well-connected. 90% of the relief would go to borrowers earning less than $75,000 a year, and you're not even eligible if you're making over $125,000 a year. That's in stark contrast, of course, to the Trump tax scam, where 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. Moreover, my Republican colleagues refuse to acknowledge the serious questions that have been raised about how the resolution would actually be implemented, because under the Congressional Review Act resolution, you don't get to pick and choose which parts of a rule you're overturning. You have to overturn the whole rule, including the pause in student loan payments and the deferral of interest. Now, how do you unpause a payment that you were supposed to make many months ago? And and what's going to happen to all those interest payments that now have to be added back to the loans? That's about $233 per month in interest and principal. And what happens to the credits that participants in public service loan forgiveness were promised during those months? Are these firefighters and teachers and police officers and other public service who may have had their loans forgiven now on the hook for 4 additional payments? The reality is that H.J. Res. 45 would trigger a wave of delinquencies and defaults for our most vulnerable borrowers. Intentionally or not, this resolution would create chaos for borrowers and their families, as well as the loan servicers. And the Congressional Research Service has confirmed that this chaos would be triggered by the retroactive application of this rule. Mr. Speaker, anyone in this country who wants to take advantage of the benefits of a college education should be able to do so, not just the wealthy few. And that's the way it used to be just several decades ago. Pell Grants covered 80% of the cost of attending a state college. Now it's less than 30%. And adjusted for inflation, states are paying less for colleges, for state colleges, than they used to. This proposal does nothing to help students pay for the college education, and so I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose the resolution and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia's reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia who introduced this resolution and is the chair of the Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions Subcommittee, Mr. Good.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Fox. I am proud to be the sponsor of this resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act to hold President Biden accountable for his reckless, unfair, unlawful, unconstitutional student loan transfer scheme. President Biden simply does not have the authority to, quote, forgive, unquote, loans and thereby spend unilaterally more than $300 billion. In fact, he even admitted that to CNN host Anderson Cooper in February of 2021, saying, "I don't think I have the authority to do it by signing with a pen." Democrats, in fact, he knew he didn't have the power to do it and advised him not to. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi said on July 28, 2021, quote, "People think that the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress," end quote. My friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle piled on. Representative Jared Golden of Maine said, "This decision by the president is out of touch with what the majority of the American people want from the White House, which is leadership to address the most immediate challenges the country is facing." And Representative Chris Pappas of New Hampshire said, "This announcement by President Biden is no way to make policy and sidesteps Congress and our oversight and fiscal responsibilities. Any plan to address student loans should go through the legislative process, and it should be more targeted and paid for so it doesn't add to the deficit." Representative Sharice Davids of Kansas said, "It's not how I would have addressed this issue." Yet the president decided, yet again, to act unconstitutionally. Like the timing of the depletion of our strategic petroleum reserves, this so-called student loan transfer scheme that is interesting timing just before the election. Now, despite his better judgment, a barrage of legal challenges, and this current effort by this Congress to nullify his actions, President Biden has preemptively announced that he will veto my resolution. I would invite the president to reconsider his position. Federal involvement in higher education, as a matter of fact, has done nothing to bring down the cost of college. In fact, for every $1 increase in student loan subsidies, colleges have increased their tuition by 60 cents. And all across the country, more than 92% of all student loan debt comes from federal loans, totaling over $1.6 trillion. This debt is held by just 13% of the population, in fact, the most elite 13%. It's estimated that 2/3 of the student loan transfer scheme would go to the top half of earners, not to mention that 70% of the debt is owed by students who went to graduate school. 60% of the constituents in my district don't even have a college degree, yet the Biden administration wants them to have to pay for the education of others who will have a significantly higher lifetime earning potential. Student loan cancellation doesn't make the debt actually go away. It simply shifts the cost from the student loan borrower and transfers it to hardworking American taxpayers. It's also worth mentioning that the key role this policy plays in the fiscal health of our nation as we address our debt ceiling. The principle of this resolution, nullifying President Biden's student loan transfer scheme, was one of the key provisions of the Limit, Save, Grow Act, saving $315 billion by simply asking Americans to honor their commitment to pay back their own student loans will help us to get our country's spending under control. Student loan borrowers are responsible for the debt they incurred, and Congress is responsible for the $32 trillion that we have spent. House Republicans take that seriously, which is why a month ago we passed a plan to responsibly raise the debt limit while providing historic savings for the American people. I invite Representative Pelosi and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to stand by her word and vote with me today in favor of this resolution to nullify President Biden's student loan transfer scheme. Congress must reclaim its power and act today to stop the unilateral action of President Biden that is exacerbating the higher education financial crisis. Additionally, my resolution will do what should have been done a long time ago: end the student loan repayment pause that has already cost taxpayers $195 billion. In short, this bill is needed to help steer our government spending in a more responsible direction, and I urge all of my colleagues on both sides to support this common sense legislation and vote in favor of this resolution, and I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. With that, the gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would remind my colleague from Virginia that over 90,000 borrowers in his district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted. And I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, the assistant leader, Democratic leader for the U.S. House of Representatives, gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today because my colleagues across the aisle are once again seeking to put politics over people and inflict undue economic harm, this time by denying much-needed student loan debt relief. President Biden's targeted student loan debt relief plan is designed to help low and middle-income borrowers, with 90% of the relief going to those earning less than $75,000 per year. In my home state of South Carolina, over 680,000 borrowers are eligible, of which over 67% are Pell Grant recipients. Over 48,000 borrowers in my district alone have been fully approved for relief. If enacted, House Joint Resolution 45 will rescind life-changing relief for hard-working borrowers, renege on payment clause by forcing them to pay several months of installments with interest, and claw back earned credit from public service toward the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. For many, this will mean thousands of dollars in payments with little to no notice. Cruelty seems to be the point. Mr. Speaker, President Biden's student loan debt relief plan will help alleviate the yoke of student loan debt for millions of Americans. Challenges to the program, both in court and posed by those in Congress, are meritless. Higher education shouldn't be a luxury for a privileged few. Borrowers deserve our help, and I urge my colleagues to vote down this resolution. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, who's a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, Mr. Wahlberg.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank my chairman and thank you, Speaker. I rise today in support of H.J. Res. 45, introduced by my colleague, Mr. Good. This resolution will block President Biden's illegal debt transfer scheme, forcing those who either did not attend college, saved and sacrificed to pay their way through school, or those who paid off their loans to pay for someone else's debt is simply unfair. Estimates show 570,000 of my constituents, nearly 3/4 of my district, will not benefit from this giveaway. Yet as taxpayers, they'll still be on the hook for over $3,500. It will further fuel inflation, but does nothing to address the rising cost of college. Simply put, the president's illegal debt transfer is a slap in the face to those who paid their bills or did not go to college. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this resolution, and I yield back.
Members are again reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. With that, the gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd remind my colleague from Michigan that over 90,000 borrowers in this district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted. And I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Paramici.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this misinformed attempt by our Republican colleagues to deny some needed financial relief to about 43 million Americans. Education is the best investment we can make to give everyone the opportunity to be successful in school and in life. But this Congress, we've repeatedly seen how willing our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are to put politics over people and special interests over students, and this CRA is no different. Facts matter, so let's set the record straight. President Biden's loan forgiveness plan helps a lot of borrowers with debt but no degree. Many are borrowers who were defrauded by their schools or who had to take on other responsibilities and couldn't complete their education. And the president's plan directs 90%, let me repeat, 90% of relief to borrowers earning less than $75,000 per year. This may be news to my colleagues who continue to misrepresent that student debt relief will be a bailout for the rich. It's not. Another fact, because of interest capitalization and negative amortization, many student loan borrowers who are current on their payments still have loan balances that are the same as or even greater when they first took out their loan. That's unfair. But beyond the numbers, we must humanize who will be hurt the most if we allow this CRA to pass. Our nation's teachers in red and blue districts who work with students every day. Healthcare workers and first responders in red and blue districts who keep our communities safe and healthy. Caregivers in red and blue districts who support the work of raising and sustaining families. Our nation's small business owners in red and blue districts who make communities vibrant and unique. I urge my colleagues to show some humanity, compassion, and empathy. Let's pass good faith policies that make college more affordable and recognize the intrinsic value of opportunity and possibility in every American. I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this regressive resolution that will harm people in Oregon and across the country, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my colleagues' comments, but we're showing compassion to the 87% of the people in this country who play by the rules, paid their bills, or didn't go to college. And the 13% who did take out debt who haven't paid it back should show similar compassion to their fellow human beings and not ask them to pay their bills. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia who's a member of the Education Workforce Committee, Mr. Allen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for yielding the time. I rise today in strong support of H.J. Res. 45, which would overturn President Biden's egregious student loan transfer scheme. Our nation is $31 trillion in debt. We're staring down a debt ceiling deadline due to the president's inaction. And yes, this administration is dead set on enacting costly programs like a massive student loan bailout that will increase the financial burden on those who did not take out a loan themselves. Hardworking taxpayers will be stuck with a tab of over $300 billion and $1.44 billion in the 12th district alone, my district. Broken down further, the residents of Georgia's 12th district would each have to pay the federal government an additional $3,525. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, student loan cancellation doesn't make the debt go away. It shifts the cost from the student loan borrowers who made a financial commitment and transfers it to the U.S. taxpayers. Forcing hardworking taxpayers to foot the bill for student loans they didn't borrow is simply unconstitutional, period. Democrats would also have you believe that canceling student loan debt would reduce the cost of college tuition. We can all agree that addressing ballooning college costs is paramount, but studies show increasing subsidies to colleges and universities causes the cost of college to increase. This overreaching plan is going to make the financial burden of pursuing a college degree even more severe. Overall, the student loan transfer scheme is unfair to hardworking Americans and unfair to future students. I urge a yes vote on this resolution to overturn the Biden administration's radical student loan bailout. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind my colleague from Georgia that over 110,000 borrowers from his district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted. And I yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for yielding time. I rise in strong opposition to this resolution to nullify the Biden administration's federal student loan forgiveness rule. At a time when students need relief the most, Republicans are working to upend student loan forgiveness that started under Trump and now continues under President Biden for more than 40 million borrowers. There was a broad recognition during the pandemic that relief was desperately needed for businesses, families, and students. That is why Congress and Republicans under Trump voted to pass both the CARES Act and the HEROES Act, which provided not only student loan relief, but also loans to protect businesses from shuttering and direct support to families. These were forgivable loans that we gave to businesses. We helped workers and small businesses alike during the height of the pandemic. Again, both President Trump and President Biden paused student loan payments. And under this CRA we are debating today, we would see a rollback on the loan payment pause through September 2022. This is unimaginable. Do not be fooled by the faux populism of Republicans. They raised the debt ceiling 3 times to pay for their tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% in America. By contrast, President Biden's targeted student loan relief plan helps Americans earning less than $75,000 a year. When Democrats were in the majority and on the hook for providing assistance, we rose to the occasion to help small businesses and employees alike. We did not renege on our support for businesses through the PPP loans. And I see no reason why Republicans now insist on reneging on their support for students. Why, for the love of God, do Republicans want to continue to punch down on America's students and divide our country? The Biden administration student debt relief plan is not a bailout, it is a lifeline. And I implore my Republican colleagues in Congress to speak with borrowers in their own districts about this very issue. College debt has been weighing on borrowers across all demographics across the country, including in their own districts. This should not be a partisan issue, and I oppose the resolution.
The gentleman from Virginia has reserved, and the gentlewoman from North Carolina recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, who is chair of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee, Mr. Bean.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You get 3527. You get 3527. You get 3527. Mr. Speaker, whether you like it or not, you've just acquired $3,527 in new student loan debt. That's right. Thanks to this crazy student loan bailout, every man, woman, and child in America will owe $3,527 to foot the bill for someone else's debt. But, Mr. Speaker, aren't we already in a debt crisis? Yes, we are. We already have a whopping $32 trillion in debt. We're struggling right now to come to an agreement on how we're going to pay our bills. But this administration's student loan bailout will just throw gasoline on the inflation fire, making it even harder for our families to put food on the table. It's the last thing our economy needs. But, Mr. Speaker, is this fair? Of course it's not fair. This bailout sounds like a Houdini-type escape from the responsibility of student loan debt, but instead, 87% of Americans without student loan debt will end up paying for the 13% of Americans who do. How do you tell someone who's worked their way through college or joined the military, like my son, to get through school, that they will now be saddled with paying off a Harvard graduate's underwater fire safety degree? This wacky student bailout is unfair to taxpayers and unfair to future generations of students. Mr. Speaker, the whole plan is nuts. There's only one correct answer, and that's to vote yes on this Congressional Review Act. Mr. Speaker, let's bring sense and sensibility to America's education system while protecting the interest of taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would remind my colleague from Florida that almost 120,000 borrowers from his district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted. And I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, the ranking member of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, Ms. Adams.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Virginia, our ranking member, for yielding. Today, I rise in opposition to House Resolution 45, which will disapprove of waivers and modifications on borrowers of federal student loans. As a former educator of 40 years, I'm ashamed and I'm astonished to see that my colleagues will introduce such divisive, misleading, and harmful resolutions. This partisan, all-Republican-led bill would end the one-time debt relief and the December payment pause. The Department of Education would also be prevented from issuing a similar ruling to the Biden administration, one-time debt relief and extension of payment pauses in the future. And so let me be clear. This barely one-page bill does absolutely nothing to advance, to enrich, or to uplift borrowers. Under the Biden administration's plan, 43 million borrowers would be eligible for student loan relief, and 20 million would be eligible for full forgiveness of their loan, ensuring that individuals affected by emergencies, including COVID, are not placed in a worse financial position. Within my own district, there are more than 120,000 estimated eligible borrowers under the Biden student loan relief plan. 79,000 of those borrowers were deemed automatically eligible for relief, and that's about 65% of the eligible borrowers, and 50,000 of those, more than 50,000, were fully approved applicants that were sent over to loan servicers for discharge, and that's about 42% of the eligible borrowers in my district. Tens of thousands of constituents from my district and across the country will have the ability to live their lives without the looming effects of student loan debt. And just imagine the millions of borrowers that would be impacted across this country as well. But unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle fail to realize the impact that this would make for so many Americans. This legislation moves to rid student aid borrowers in this country of any opportunity to better their financial situations, a step towards borrowers buying that house, taking that loan-awaited trip, starting the family they wanted to start, starting the business. Education is an American right and a privilege, and no one should deny that right from anyone. I look forward to having a meaningful conversation, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, my colleagues want us to feel so sorry for these people who took out these loans and are not going to pay them back. My colleague in the 12th District in North Carolina said 121,000 people in her district. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know who I am feeling sorry for? The 622,600 people who are being asked to pay off the bill that those 121,000 people took out willingly and have benefited from. This is a backward way of looking at things. And again, compassion should be shown to the 622,600 people who didn't take out the loan but are now being asked to pay it back. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Illinois, who's Vice Chair of the Education and Workforce Committee, Mrs. Miller.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly oppose President Biden's proposal to force blue-collar workers in my district to pay off the student loans of borrowers who attended universities who are sitting on billion-dollar endowments. In my district, there are 599,500 constituents who are not being asked to, but will be forced to pay the student loan debt that people agreed to take out. This plan is unfair to responsible Americans who have diligently worked hard and saved money to fund their education. Furthermore, it's important to acknowledge the dedication of our military members who earned tuition benefits through their service. The rising costs of higher education deserve careful examination. Particularly concerning is the growing number of administrative positions focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We must investigate the significant increase in administrative expenses that do not directly contribute to providing students with a quality education leading to meaningful employment. Universities that charge exorbitant amounts for humanities degrees in cultural Marxism should bear the responsibility when their graduates struggle to repay their loans due to a lack of viable employment opportunities. I urge my colleagues to prioritize the interests of taxpayers by opposing this proposal put forth by President Biden. And I see you laughing over there. I don't think the people that are going to be left holding the bag, paying someone else's student loan debt are laughing. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd remind my colleague from Illinois that over 75,000 borrowers from our district will be denied debt relief if this resolution is enacted. And before I yield, could I find out how much time is left on both sides?
The gentleman from Virginia has 17.25 minutes remaining.
And on the other side?
Gentlewoman from North Carolina has 11 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to House Republicans' efforts to eliminate critical student loan relief. Now, as an educator, it's shameful to me that my colleagues could look at this crisis of student debt in our country and decide to intentionally make it worse for 40 million Americans. 40 million Americans. Now, these are the same people that voted for tax breaks for billionaires and large corporations. And now they're telling everyday people that we can't afford to help them, and it's appalling. Now, when I was in the classroom, I saw my students take out loans for basic needs like rent and putting food on the table. We tell kids to go get an education, to go to college, to work towards the American dream, but that also means taking out oftentimes thousands of dollars of loans. Student loan debt also disproportionately impacts people of color, low-income students, and millions of young people that may not have had access to financial training. Millionaires are not burdened with student debt. Working-class people are. So let's be clear, Republicans in the House are putting billionaires and large corporations over students. I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again in support of H.J. Res. 45 and urge my colleagues to pass this bill. The Democrats in the White House have accused Republicans of working against the interest of our constituents. However, this just shows how out of touch Democrats are with the realities of the people in my district. While the White House likes to point to the fact that 75,000 of my constituents are eligible for the administration's bailout, they conveniently ignore that 675,000 of them, or over 90%, receive no benefit from this illegal scam. Moreover, 212,000 of my constituents have never even stepped foot on a college campus. According to the National Taxpayers Union estimate, the administration's blanket loan cancellation and income-driven repayment plan will cost over $3,500 per constituent. This will cost the hardworking constituents in my district $1.2 billion alone. Mr. Speaker, there's no such thing as debt forgiveness. The administration's student debt scheme simply transfers the cost from well-off college graduates to the backs of my constituents. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.J. Res. 45 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I oppose this legislation that will harm 43 million student loan borrowers who need debt relief so that the Republicans can spend trillions of dollars in just a few weeks on tax cuts for the wealthiest 1%. Borrowers in my congressional district alone will lose and be affected to the tune of 100,000, over 1.5 million in Illinois. The maliciousness of this legislation is appalling. The bill will ban relief for 43 million borrowers and also draw back relief that millions of borrowers already received. This heartless bill will force public servants like firefighters, teachers, social service providers, legal aid workers, and nonprofit workers to make additional payments. The callousness of this bill is heightened because the Republicans are bragging that they will spend trillions of dollars in just a few weeks to give trillions in tax breaks to the wealthy 1% while inflicting economic harm on Americans struggling with student loan debt. I reject this bill and yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to let Representative Davis know that in Illinois 11, 655,200 people don't have student debt, and they'll be the ones bearing the cost of the transfer from 90,800 people. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you for yielding time. Mr. Speaker, America is a country built on the idea of freedom. Freedom to most means the ability to live and make decisions without unreasonable constraints. Freedom does not mean freedom from individual responsibility. Unfortunately, President Biden and those who support his wealthy student loan giveaway scheme have gotten it backwards. They believe that hardworking, blue-collar Tennesseans should foot the bills for the wealthy. Simply put, this is plain wrong. Because in America, we are free to make decisions on our own, and no one should be responsible for someone else's personal decisions. By forcing this draconian student loan buyout down the throats of taxpayers, President Biden is hindering our freedom. That's why I urge my colleagues to join me in standing on the side of freedom by voting yes on House Joint Resolution 45. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd remind my colleague from Tennessee that 89,000 borrowers from his district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted. And I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington, member of the Education and Workforce Committee, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this cruel resolution that will force low and middle income student loan borrowers to face severe financial hardship. In a reckless reversal of the payment pause, this measure sends an average of $1,000 in surprise student loan bills to over 40 million Americans. This absurd approach to block President Biden's student debt relief plan hurts those who are most at risk. Older Americans owe a fifth of all student debt. Their debt has increased fivefold in the last 20 years. Black Americans owe an average of $44,800 in student debt. Over 6 million Americans living in rural areas owe an average of $35,000. And reversals to the public service loan forgiveness would put 260,000 public servants and 46,000 service members back under the thumb of these crushing payments. Those who receive that public service loan forgiveness have played by the rules for years and sacrificed too much to have partisan efforts steal relief that they were already given and counting on. Our job is to protect working people, and that should mean ensuring that no one goes into unpayable debt just to get a degree to pursue their dreams. This Republican plan would increase the likelihood of defaulting for teachers, for law enforcement, for public servants across the board, and it would be a drop in the bucket toward actually addressing the deficit. Yet, Republicans took $1.9 trillion from taxpayers and handed it to corporations in tax cuts, and dozens of them have absolutely no qualms in pocketing over $22 million in PPP forgiveness, just in this body across the aisle. Congress should be prioritizing aid to seniors and borrowers from working families, not the wealthy. Vote no on this extreme, unworkable, and cruel resolution. And, Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter signed by over 260 organizations, including labor, civil rights, and consumer protection groups, calling on Congress to reject this harmful resolution.
Without objection.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are doing their best to gaslight the 87% of their constituents who are going to be saddled with the debt from the 13%. In Washington 7, there are 686,200 people who don't have any college debt who are going to be asked to pay the debt off for 84,300 people. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished, Mr. Speaker, 4 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas who's a member of the Education Workforce Committee, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman is reminded.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to Congressman Good of Virginia for introducing House Joint Resolution 45 and for Chairwoman Fox for her leadership in getting this important resolution to the floor. Just a few statistics from my particular district in Northeast Texas. Almost 70% of my district does not hold a college degree. And under this program, effectively what the President is asking is for those 70% to subsidize the college educations of the rest of those individuals in my district. The cost for my district is $1.55 billion. Estimated number of constituents ineligible for my student debt relief in my district is 640,000 individuals out of 767,000 individuals in East Texas. Nearly 30 years ago, when I began my post-education studies, I had to support myself through college. My parents wanted to do that, but they couldn't do it because of their financial status at the time. So paying for college was a matter of personal responsibility for me. Better stated, it was a matter of personal investment for my future. It's an investment that I chose to make. It's an investment that I knew I needed to make to fulfill God's call on my life. To pay for my education, I took on a variety of jobs, including being a server at a restaurant, running a venue route, serving as a painter's helper, even roofing a roof in the middle of the hot Texas sun. Several other jobs to do that. There was still a gap between what college was going to cost me and what I could earn on my own during those summer and weekend jobs that I had. Despite my hard work, that shortfall was still there, so I picked up college loans. But when I did so, I evaluated what I was going to have to repay in the future. I looked at the degree programs I was studying. I looked at the future repayment plans that were going to have to be before me, and I knew that it was a matter of my personal responsibility to pay back that loan that was going to benefit me and benefit my family. It was not a matter of me taking out those loans, believing that others would in fact be on the hook to pay for them. As a father of 4 school-age children, we're now going through that same process with my older 2 children to determine what are we going to do about their future. But it's a decision we know we need to make and an obligation we know we need to keep on the backside of taking out any loans. Unfortunately, that's a conversation a lot of families don't have in this world before they send their kids off to school, and we need to make sure that there's more information out there before they incur the debt that ultimately they're going to have to repay. But to saddle that repayment on the backs of others that have not benefited from it is simply wrong-headed. And frankly, it's unconstitutional for the executive branch to take that action without going through the legislative branch, but that is precisely what the President is attempting to do. So I stand in opposition to the student loan debt forgiveness program and in support of Mr. Good's joint resolution. I look forward to this being on the floor. I look forward to Americans in this country understanding that when they take an obligation for a loan repayment, that they are going to repay it, not others. Because once we assume the obligations of every other person in this country, the free market capitalist society that drives our economy is gone, and we do not need to see that. With that, I yield, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To remind my colleague from Texas that over 88,000 borrowers in his district will be denied relief if this resolution is enacted, and I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you so much. I hope the American people are watching this shameful act to halt assistance on student debt for millions of Americans. Mr. Speaker, 90% of people who will benefit from President Biden's student relief make less than $75,000. I think my good colleague from Texas, as he says, you know, these folks making all these difficult decisions. How about this? Why don't those folks that took out PP loans over there, that got it completely forgiven, give that money back? Because you're asking teachers, firefighters, all who are drowning in education debt, who benefited from a public service loan forgiveness program, you're asking them to pay it back while they're serving our country in all different forms, reverse it all, add the interest back as well. Let them struggle and suffer while, again, they are educating our children and protecting our communities.
This is all happening, Mr. Speaker, while the far-right Republicans have filed a sham lawsuit to take it before an unhinged, corrupt Supreme Court that has secretly accepted lavish trips and payments from billionaire Republican mega donors while considering striking down your student debt relief. Now, Republican colleagues, including many, again, took out over $20 million in PPP loans. During the pandemic, when everybody was suffering, they were completely forgiven. They want to hurt fellow Americans who aren't wealthy like they are. They want to repeal the President's Student Relief Program that has changed the lives of 43 million Americans for the better. Under President Biden's debt relief program alone in Michigan, in the state, over 1.3 million residents were helped with the burden of crushing student debt. I don't know, Mr. Speaker. Maybe they're doing this because student relief is tied to racial justice. We know that more than 20 million borrowers will be completely debt-free, and 1 in 4 of them are Black borrowers. Our communities have been denied the ability to build generational wealth for far too long, targeted by policy, violence, systematic racism, and an economic system that is fueled by corporate greed. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow the same Republicans who had millions of dollars in PPP loans forgiven repeal student debt relief. For the hypocrisy is disgusting. I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I inquire as to how much time is left?
The gentlewoman from North Carolina has 4¼ minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
The gentleman from 3/4 minutes.
And can I inquire how much time is left?
Quarters. 10 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this resolution. And I want to say something. My Republican colleagues are pushing a narrative that student debt relief is unfair. And to my colleagues, I agree with you. I agree that what's going on is unfair. Folks who paid off their debt, the fact that they had to have it in the first place is unfair. The fact that students still have to take out crushing student debt just to get a college education, that is unfair. And if we legislated using the logic that you bring to this issue here today, women and Black folks wouldn't have the right to vote because it would be unfair to those who never got to vote before them. See, if we legislated using your logic, that because there was an injustice, we can't fix it because it's unfair to those who never had it fixed, means we would never progress on any issue in this country. Why do you bring that bigoted logic to this issue as it relates to students, but not any other issue?
Demand his words be taken down.
The gentleman will suspend.
You said your bigoted logic.
Take a seat. The clerk will report the words. Without objection? The offending words are withdrawn. The gentleman will proceed in order.
If we used this logic on every single issue, we would never have progress on anything. And the truth of the matter is that young people and people don't have student debt because we live beyond our means. We have student debt because we've been denied the means to live. And it's important to understand that Congress needs to help fix this damaged economy, which gets more unequal and unequitable every single day. This bill today is not delivering that help. It's making things worse. And to people watching at home, to young people, to people with student debt, just know that the Republican Party here, my colleagues in this chamber, are fighting to take away the relief that you need and that you deserve. This is about fairness, and true fairness is ensuring that everyone has equitable opportunity. 20 million constituents robbed of relief by their own representatives is what this bill is about. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 2.5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to point out that in the 10th District of Florida, 654,500 people will be paying the debt for 122,500 people. Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 decades, tuition and fees have increased nearly 3 times the rate of inflation. Democrats continually talk about how college is unaffordable, yet fail to realize their failed policies exacerbate the problem of outrageous college costs. More federal aid and generous generous loan subsidies allow schools to increase their prices to capture those additional funds. Economists at the New York Federal Reserve found that for every $1 increase in student loan subsidies, colleges increased their tuition 60 cents. Another study found colleges reduced their own grant aid by as much as 83 cents for every dollar students receive in taxpayer student aid. The Biden administration's telling borrowers someone else will pay their loan and telling institutions someone else will cover the cost of tuition. It's no wonder the Congressional Budget Office found that the Biden administration's new income-driven repayment plan alone will increase student borrowing by 12%. Let's work towards actually lowering college costs, not dumping hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars on well-off college graduates to make the problem worse. Again, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.J. Res. 45 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kamala Dove.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to condemn Republicans' attack on education. They want to ban teachers, books, the opportunity to learn history, and now they want to ban relief for students. This bill would block President Biden's debt forgiveness plan, forcing everyone who took advantage of the pause in payments to pay interest on every payment missed. In addition, this plan would hit our valuable public servants the hardest, those who took advantage of the public loan forgiveness program, like nurses, firefighters, law enforcement, and child care providers. And if you want some real truth, let's not get it twisted. PPP was not a grant, and yet some of my Republican colleagues literally received millions in PPP loans, and I don't see anyone rushing to pay those back. Talk about unfair. The American people are paying those bills that they didn't incur. Nope. Republicans don't want to forgive anyone or anything except themselves, and the American people deserve forgiveness. This legislation will harm low and middle income families, including 20.6 million of Republicans' own constituents. But they won't say that. So American people, if you don't know, now you know. Let's enact legislation that encourages affordable education and economic mobility so that the American people can learn and earn. Republicans, please get out of your and my constituents' way. I ask a no vote on this, and thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll reserve.
Reserves. Gentlewoman reserved. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley.
Thank you. I rise today on behalf of borrowers
burden borrowers throughout the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District and borrowers everywhere. I rise today on behalf of third grade teacher who spent a decade in the classroom month by month making their student loan payments. On behalf of the mother juggling 3 part-time jobs, trying her best to stretch her paycheck to cover rent and to pay down her student debt. For the 1 in 4 black borrowers who will have their student loans fully canceled under President Biden's historic plan. You see, Mr. Speaker, student debt cancellation can and will change and save lives. And this isn't hyperbole, it is reality. A diverse coalition of voters came together to press for cancellation, critical payment pauses, and updates to the Essential Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Under this cruel measure, 260,000 public service workers could see their debt reinstated. Nurses, educators, firefighters, military service members. Let me make it plain. The president has the legal authority to cancel student debt. And let me just say this. I took out loans. I paid off those loans. It took me 20 plus years while being a caregiver to my mother, while working 3 jobs sometimes. I took out those loans and I paid them off, but I want an easier road for the next person. The cost of higher education has increased by 150%. So I do not call this student debt forgiveness because borrowers have done nothing wrong. They don't need to be forgiven anything, but they are deserving of, and they do need relief. And to anyone who seeks to mislead the public and to use the courts or harmful measures to gut essential relief, take a seat.
Gentleman for
The
Virginia
people
yields.
deserve and demand this relief, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll reserve. I'm prepared to close whenever the gentleman from Virginia is prepared.
Thank you, Mr.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close, and will close, yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there are many challenges we have in higher education that demand our attention. The rising costs of higher education, the student debt crisis, the eroded value of the Pell Grant, mental health issues, the list goes on. But instead of addressing these challenges, we are trying to force through a resolution that hurts tens of millions of student borrowers and their families, an average of almost 100,000 in each of our districts. Many of my colleagues on the other side have justified this resolution by arguing that we can't afford it. But it's just a matter of priorities. Congressional Republicans are willing to charge taxpayers more than twice as much for a tax package where 80% of the benefits were scheduled to go to the top 1% in corporations, but now they are unwilling to invest half that amount to help student borrowers pay for their education. We should be passing proposals that meaningfully support borrowers and make college more affordable for current and future borrowers. But the bottom line is that it is our responsibility to strengthen the support for those seeking a college degree, because those who want a college degree should be able to access that opportunity. That opportunity should not be reserved for just the wealthy few. So I urge my colleagues to oppose H.J. Res. 45, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know that access to college is available to every single person in this country. It is not a matter of access. It's a matter of who's paying back their loans. Coupled with the permanent repayment pause, expansive new regulations, and a radical new income-driven repayment plan, the Biden administration's student loan scam could end up costing taxpayers $1 trillion. That's more than the federal government has ever spent on post-secondary education. The Biden administration's policies do nothing to solve the root issues of student debt. And if this bailout moves forward, outstanding student debt will return to current levels in just over 5 years. We'll be right back here again. The federal student loan system is broken and real reform is needed. Simply put, the administration's action will mean that future students will come to expect their loans will be canceled, and colleges will continue to increase already skyrocketing tuition because they know Democrats will leave taxpayers to foot the bill. We need to hold colleges accountable for charging outrageous prices for degrees with no value. We need a student loan program that has the best interests of students and taxpayers in mind. As the institution that holds the power of the purse, Congress has the responsibility to protect the interest of taxpayers. A vote in support of today's resolution will do just that. Again, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.J. Res. 45, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Pursuant to House Resolution 429, the previous question is ordered on the joint resolution. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title V United States Code of the rules submitted by the Department of Education relating to waivers and modifications of federal student loans.
The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is passed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Yes, ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed.